Hello, this is Aware on the Air, a weekly program brought to you by friends and members of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. Tonight we have a panel to discuss various aspects of American conflicts around the world and on the themes of war and racism. And I hope we can get everyone in and give them adequate time to say something significant. So I want to start off by mentioning some of the items in the news this week, hoping that my colleagues here will comment on them and tell us what these things have meant to them. I want to skip over the Sergeant Bergdahl case largely. It's become so messy now that Sergeant Bergdahl has been rescued from the Taliban, apparently, in Afghanistan. But there's a big conflict about what that's supposed to mean and how it came about. Was he a deserter? Was he worthy of being rescued from the Taliban? Well, it turns out to be very complicated. He apparently had wandered away from his post there 2 or 3 times before, as many other men had done in these outposts in Afghanistan. And it's quite common, apparently, because those outposts are saturated with alcohol and narcotics, and it's a fairly common thing, but no big issue is made out of it, except when someone sees a chance, perhaps, to batter Barack Obama with something concerning the case. So was he ransomed? That's the accusations being made now. Were we negotiating with terrorists? And on it goes. So the whole thing has become a kind of chamber of horrors for some people. And I have nothing special to say about it, although perhaps some of our colleagues will chime in. From Syria, the news is that American supplies are going to, non-lethal supplies, to the fighters there, the rebels, and now there's a movement to send them lethal supplies as well, which has been done indirectly, actually, for months. This is being presented to us as if it's news, but it's been going on for a long time, actually. Concerning Israel, Palestine, there's a lot of turmoil now, especially in the American Jewish community, about unconditional support of Israel, everything that it does. There's a feeling that world public opinion is turning against Israel, or at least the right-wing regime in Israel, and it's causing a lot of conflict and consternation. In the last week, we've been treated to a lot of anti-Russian propaganda, and Ukraine is now is in such turmoil that, again, it's hard to say anything that would make sense, at least to me. But there are some notes I have here on today, Associated Press reporting that tax cheats took billions from Ukraine. There's a report on the chamber, soundproof chamber in Ukraine, in which some of these arrangements were made. It had, it's an all steel room made soundproof with white noise in it to prevent anything from being recorded, and all transparent furniture, so you could see that there were no microphones hidden anywhere in the furniture. It's quite an amazing story. But anyway, American President Obama, this says, warns Russia over its dark tactics, offers Kiev security aid for the American military or
There's no
government
way you
to
could
talk
say that
about
with a straight
dark,
face, right?
dark tactics by some other government
Yeah.
is kind of funny in itself. But anyway, so we've issued these warnings to Russia about Ukraine. And we've also issued warnings to China about disturbing the international order. U.S. warns China that Washington will not remain passive if the international order is threatened. That is the international order as ordained by the USA, apparently.
Exactly.
Today, first headline, friendly fire strike kills 5 special operations soldiers in Afghanistan. 5 American Special Operations service members and at least 1 Afghan soldier were killed when coalition aircraft accidentally unleashed an airstrike on their position in southern Afghanistan, one of the deadliest instances of friendly fire in more than a decade of war. Afghan and American officials said Tuesday, skipping, since the war began, there have been more than a dozen episodes in which airstrikes mistakenly claimed the lives of allies, or gunfights erupted between coalition troops unaware that they were firing at one another. So the whole thing is breaking down into a kind of fiasco the way the war in Vietnam did many years ago. The USA is entering into a propaganda battle apparently in Central Africa because the Chinese are creating a presence there. And the USA, this says, now quietly backs a Nigerian TV channel to counter the terror group. So there will be a 24-hour satellite television channel set up in the northern region of Nigeria. The move signals a ramping up of American counterinsurgency efforts to directly challenge the terrorist group Boko Haram, which abducted nearly 300 Nigerian schoolgirls in Africa. So there's plenty of turmoil and so-called anarchy around over the world, but we'll let some of these other people tell you about that. So, Deb, you want to start next?
Well, I just want to mention that I saw a picture on the internet of the Taliban men that were released, and one of them was supposedly in a picture with 5 heads. You know, I don't know if anybody else got to see that, but this guy was a picture was taken of him with these heads lined up, and I didn't write down what his name was. But I remember seeing the picture before and was just like, okay.
Who's he and who was he and who were the heads?
One of the men that were released, the Taliban, there were 5 of them, I believe, was one of these gentlemen previously had a picture taken with 5 heads.
So this is American propaganda about the people who were releasing from Guantanamo.
Yes.
The 5 Taliban members were members of the Taliban government that the U.S. displaced when we invaded Afghanistan, and they certainly were part of the resistance to foreign invasion. They were involved in that because they were officials of that government. But it seems to me that the attempt by the American press and government to say these are barbarians, who are rightly put down by the United States, tries to obfuscate the real politics of the situation and what the U.S. is doing in imprisoning people at Guantanamo. So
They will return to fighting and killing Americans, according to some. The flip-flops of Senator McCain on this are fascinating in themselves and raising more suspicions about being kind of senile in some respects. But
I wonder what would have been said if people had suggested that McCain should not have been released from North Vietnam because he'd returned to fighting and killed Vietnamese, which indeed he did.
Yes.
I mean, or
Right.
at least he was involved in the operation that killed more Vietnamese when he came back. He was apparently a very bad flyer, had crashed 5 times and so forth, and there's some suggestion that he was at least as congenial to his Vietnamese hosts as Mr. Borgdahl might be, to the point of, so I mean, McCain's own history is worth comparing with that of the people we released from Guantanamo.
Go ahead, please, Deb.
Okay, the title of my little talk today is Creating the Myth of Democracy, and I found this from the Freedom Informant Network, written by Bruce Levin, a clinical psychologist and author of Get Up, Stand Up, Uniting Populists, Energizing the Defeated, and Battling the Corporate Elite. And he has a website, brucelevin.net. But basically, he gets into how our young people are really being turned away from democracy itself. And he says traditionally young people have energized democratic movements. So it is a major coup for the ruling elite to have created societal institutions that have subdued young Americans and broken their spirit of resistance to domination. And I'm going to just quickly go through the eight reasons that he has in this article. The first one is student loan debt. Today in the United States, 2/3 of graduating seniors at four-year colleges have student loan debt, including over 62% of public university graduates. While average undergraduate debt is close to $25,000, I increasingly, he says, talk to college graduates with closer to $100,000 in student loan debt. During the time in one's life when it should be easiest to resist authority, he says, because one does not yet have family responsibilities, many young people worry about the cost of bucking authority, losing their job, and being unable to pay an ever-increasing debt. In a vicious cycle, student debt has subduing effect on activism, and political passivity makes it more likely that students will accept such debt as a natural part of their life. The second one, psychopathologizing and medicating noncompliance. In 1955, Eric Fromm, and then widely respected anti-authoritarian leftist psychoanalyst, try saying that 3 times, quote, wrote, "Today the function of psychiatry, psychology, and psychoanalysis threatens to become the tool in the manipulation of man." Fromm died in 1980, the same year that an increasingly authoritarian American elected Ronald Reagan president, and an increasingly authoritarian American Psychiatric Association added to their diagnostic Bible disruptive mental disorders for children and teenagers, such as the increasingly popular oppositional defiant disorder, ODD. The official symptoms of ODD include, quote, often actively defies or refuses to comply with adult requests or rules, often argues with adults, and often deliberately does things to annoy other people. Many of America's greatest activists, including Saul Alinsky, the legendary organizer and author of Revile for Radicals and Rules for Radicals, would today certainly be diagnosed with ODD and other disruptive disorders. Recalling his childhood, Alinsky said, "I never thought of walking on the grass until I saw a sign saying, 'Keep off the grass.' Then I would stomp all over it." Heavily tranquilizing antipsychotic drugs are now the highest grossing class of medication in the United States, $16 billion in 2010. A major reason for this, according to the Journal of American Medical Association, is that children receiving antipsychotic drugs have non-psychotic diagnosis, such as ODD or some other disruptive disorder. The third reason, schools that educate for compliance and not for democracy. The nature of most classrooms today, regardless of the subject matter, socializes students to be passive and directed by others, to follow orders, to take seriously the rewards and punishments of authorities, and but the abstract logic of the institution overwhelms the individual contributions. A generation ago, the problem of compulsory schooling as a vehicle for an authoritarian society has widely discussed, but as this problem has gotten worse, it seldom is discussed. The nature of most classrooms, regardless of the subject matter, socializes students to be passive and directed by others. to follow orders, to take seriously the rewards and punishment of authorities, to pretend to care about things they don't care about, and that they are important to affect their situation. The fourth reason, no child left behind and race to the top. The corpocracy has figured out a way to make our already authoritarian schools even more authoritarian. Democratic Republican bipartisanship has resulted in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, NAFTA, the Patriot Act, the war on drugs, the Wall Street bailout, and educational policies such as No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. These policies are essentially standardized testing tyranny that creates fear, which is antithetical to education for a democratic society. Fear forces students and teachers to constantly focus on the demands of tests. It crushes curiosity, critical thinking, questioning authority, and challenging and resisting illegitimate authority. Number 5, shaming young children who take education but not their schooling seriously. In 2006 survey of the United States, it was found that 40% of children between 1st and 3rd grade read every day, but by the 4th grade, that rate declined to 29%. Despite the anti-educational impact of standard schools, children and their parents are increasingly propagandized to believe that disliking school means disliking learning. That was not always the case in the United States. Mark Twain famously said, "I never let my schooling get in the way of my education."
Hear, hear.
Towards the end of Twain's life in 1900, only 6% of Americans graduated from high school. Today, approximately 85% of Americans graduate. But this isn't good enough. This is good enough for Barack Obama, who told us in 2009, and dropping out of high school is no longer an option. It's not just quitting on yourself, it's quitting on your country. And I just want to say, today, Americans who lack college degrees are increasingly shamed as losers. However, Gore Vidal and George Carlin, two of America's most astute and articulate critics of the corpocracy, never went to college, and Carlin dropped out of school in the 9th grade.
Wow.
Number 6, the normalization of surveillance. The fear of being surveilled makes a population easier to control. While the National Security Agency has received publicity for monitoring America's citizens' email and phone conversations, and while employer surveillance has become increasingly common in the United States, young Americans have become increasingly acquiescent to corpocracy surveillance because beginning at a young age, surveillance is routine in their lives. Parents routinely check websites for their kids' latest test grades and complete assignments, and just like employers are monitoring their children's computers and Facebook pages. Some parents use the GPS in their children's cell phones to track their whereabouts. And other parents have video cameras in their homes. Increasingly, I talk with young people who lack the confidence that they can even pull off a party when their parents are out of town. And so how much confidence are they going to have about pulling off a democratic movement below the radar of authorities? Number 7, television. In 2009, the Nielsen Company reported that TV viewing in the United States is at an all-time high if one included the following 3 screens: a television set, a computer screen, and a cell phone. American children average 8 hours a day on TV, video games, movies, the internet, cell phones, iPods, and other technologies. Many progressives are concerned about the concentrated control of content by the corporate media. But the mere act of watching TV, regardless of programming, is the primary pacifying agent. Private enterprise prisons have recognized that providing inmates with cable television can be a more economical method to keep them quiet and subdued than it would be to hire guards. Number 8, fundamentalist religion and fundamentalist consumerism. American culture offers young Americans the choices of fundamentalist religion and fundamentalist consumerism. All varieties of fundamentalism narrow one's focus and inhibit critical thinking. While some progressives are fond of calling fundamentalist religion the opiate of the masses, they too often neglect the pacifying nature of America's other major fundamentalism. Fundamentalist consumerism pacifies young Americans in a variety of ways. Fundamentalist consumerism destroys self-reliance, creating people who feel completely dependent on others and who are thus more likely to turn over decision-making powers to authorities, the precise mindset that the ruling elite loves to see. A fundamentalist consumer culture legitimizes advertising, propaganda, and all kinds of manipulations, including lies. And when a society gives legitimacy to lies and manipulativeness, it destroys the capacity of people to trust one another and form democratic movements. These are not the only aspects of our culture that are subduing young Americans and crushing their resistance to domination. The food industrial complex has helped create an epidemic of childhood obesity, depression, and passivity. The prison industrial complex keeps young authoritarians in line, and now by the fear that they may become before judges, such as the two Pennsylvania ones who took $2.6 million from private industry prisons to ensure that juveniles were incarcerated. As Ralph Waldo Emerson observed, all our things are right and wrong together. The wave of evil washes over our institutions alike.
Thank you, Deb. Questions or comments for Deb?
I have a comment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go
I was
ahead.
thinking just the other day, I agree with, everything here. Although when it comes to educating for compliance and authority, I don't think that's anything new. It may be more so now. I wouldn't know. But one thing I also know, anyone who's been in, number 4, anyone who's been involved in education, whatever level, knows that the No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, the standardization of tests is an abomination. What I was thinking about just today was that Facebook has served an excellent means of educating, of communication, but I also wonder if it falls down in that it gives everyone the opportunity to express themselves, their anger, and walk away from it. I think that it inhibits true resistance. And so
Hashtag activism, it's called.
there you go. There you go.
That's Twitter, but still.
Yeah, but the same thing.
That's a great point.
Yeah, and I think that's something, I think at the beginning, it's a good thing that we can communicate, and I learned so much from some of the postings I read,
me
from
too.
all of you sitting here, and I see people expressing their anger, but I also know that a lot of these people, that's it. Facebook is it. So I just pose that as a suggestion.
Yeah. The thing I missed was the role of drugs in all of this. Tranquilizers, Ritalin for supposedly hyperactive children, especially boys. And
It's common. It's so
we are the
common.
biggest pill poppers and drug users in the world by far, apparently.
Yeah.
And I think as this author should have mentioned, we are becoming a drugged society, and that the practice of medicine, some say, has
Yes.
degenerated into that,
Yes.
is just handing out pills for
That's
everything.
right. And not to change the subject, but a lot of these shooters, these mass killings, most of these people are on some kind of psychotropic medicine. So, that's something that we all need to think about as well.
Anything else for Deb?
I just love the notion of fundamentalist consumerism.
Yes.
And the function that it plays.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that connection made before, but that's very good. So, thank you for bringing that.
Why don't you go ahead, Stu?
Okay.
I'd like to read some of a piece about an interview with Tim DeChristopher, who was a climate activist. He was, you might know him because a few years ago there was an oil and gas auction going on in Utah, and that he wanted to oppose, and he walked in and was asked if he wanted to bid on the oil and gas parcels, and he did. And this was the start of a very interesting career. I'm raising it because even though the focus of this program is not climate activism, the approach that he has taken and the comments that he makes are so apt for how we should be thinking about activism, I think. And also, the climate crisis is really going to be driving a lot of the same things that that we as anti-war activists are going to face, as he'll make clear. So, so he was charged for, impersonating a bidder who was capable of buying things, and served most of a couple of years in prison. He's now out and at Harvard Divinity School. One of his comments is that I've never seen a place in this movement where it's considered appropriate for young people to express their anger at old people. Well, more about that later. But really, I'll come back to that.
You don't want to insult any of us here.
Us old people were about to object, so go ahead.
Right, how dare you?
Well,
Actually, I agree with Tim.
well, I mean,
on that, but-
a theme of this is that there's this conflict in that, which is especially apt for the climate crisis. That no, I'll come back to his words instead of trying to insert mine. A lot of the blame falls on comfortable liberals who changed their light bulbs, bought organic, sat back and patted themselves on the back. It's only just business, like it was just business for the people in the auction room buying and selling these very cheap parcels of land so that they could destroy them. It's only just business for the people making profits. For a young person looking at climate change, it is personal. It's an older generation trading our lives for our own, I mean, I'm an old person now, short-term interests, whether that's fossil fuel executives trading our lives for profit, or whether it's baby boomer liberals trading our lives for their own comfort and convenience because they don't want to take the risk of fighting back. And he explains, I've never seen a place in this movement or in the discourse around climate change where it's considered appropriate for young people to express their anger at old people, but it's just under the surface. I don't think we can have a healthy dialogue around climate change until young people are able to express that anger in an honest way. Just like I don't think we could ever have had really honest and productive dialogues around race without the expression of black rage. Certainly we need more than just rage. On its own, it is not productive. But if it's never addressed, I think it's hard to move forward in a trusting way. I want to read a little of how he chose to take the step to doing something where he was feeling opposed to what was going on to where he decided to act. So the interviewer asks him, what was the moment like for you when you realized that you were going to go to jail? Once I started to win parcels of land at the auction, I pretty much knew I would go to prison. That moment was extremely liberating. It was the first moment that I felt that my actions were finally in line with what I felt was the scale of the crisis. And he decided to start bidding when he saw a friend burst into tears. That was one of the things that pushed me over the edge. I was feeling outraged that most of the parcels were going for $10 or $12 an acre and some for less. And I saw toward the back of the room someone I knew from my church, and she started crying. I think what drove her to tears was watching the inhumanity of it and the coldness of it. There was absolutely no respect for what was being lost. And now here's this point. The depth of her emotion justified the depth of my emotion. It made me feel that I was not crazy for being outraged. So he did effectively sabotage the auction. He ended up acquiring a lot of parcels. The auction was later ruled illegal, and all the auction sales were invalidated. But he still had this charge on him and went to and had a trial and went to prison. But before that, the interviewer asks, I'd like to go back to the moment when you stood in front of the judge and said, this is what love looks like. Can you bring yourself back to that moment and recall what you were feeling then? Were you feeling love? And he says, to some extent, yeah. This was the first chance I had had to speak freely in the court. So this was at the end of the process when he was about to be sentenced, I think. So he says, I spoke for probably half an hour. That last line, this is what love looks like, is a line that I stole from a speech that Chris Hedges gave when he was getting arrested outside the White House in 2010. He'd said, this is what hope looks like. My speech was directed at the judge. I was saying,
I'm not looking for your mercy, I'm looking for you to join me. But in a way, the judge was not really my audience. I was speaking to a much wider public about why I was there. And the interviewer asked, were you trying to get through to the jurors? No, they'd been gone for months. Do you think you would have had a chance, if you'd had the chance to talk directly to them, to the jurors, that you would have gotten through to them? He says, yes, he thinks it's possible. So what would you have told the jurors if you had had the chance? And part of the reason I'm going through this part of the process is that we're seeing now, there's a whole series of cases, for example, against whistleblowers and against people who are going onto military bases and doing civil disobedience. And they're facing very much the same thing that Tim DeChristopher did, where there's a charge, if you look strictly at the law, they're guilty of it. But what they can say, and what they do say when they're permitted to, is that they're taking these actions in a broader context. They're opposing a much greater wrong by committing a smaller wrong. And so this is how he talks about how it went for him. What would you have told the jurors if you'd had the chance? There are things about myself I would have wanted them to know, the biggest being that the auction was later overturned and ruled illegal. That was something we were absolutely not allowed to tell them. Another was the fact that we offered to pay the Bureau of Land Management the money as payment for the leases, and they wouldn't take it. And we were not allowed to talk about climate change, and so on. And the interviewer asks, and you felt that the jury had the right to choose what is called jury nullification, to actually go against the specifics of the law. When people hold onto their conscience and the shared moral agency of their community, there's no institution and no power that can't be affected by that. That would have been even more important, to remind the jury that their role is to protect citizens from the government. Juries are not just there to take orders from the government and do whatever the government wants them to do. It's the opposite. Juries were created because our founding fathers were leery of too much power in the hands of government officials. That's why we have human beings and not computers doing this job. We need jurors to use their conscience. That is the role of a citizen. Citizens should always use their conscience in all their civic duties. A pivotal moment for me, he says, came during jury selection when the judge called each juror one at a time into his chambers and asked them if they would do whatever he told them to do, even if it violated their conscience. And unless they said they were willing to do what they thought was morally wrong, they were not allowed on the jury. That really clarified for me, he says, the power of conscience is one of the key factors that determines which road we're going to go down, whether we respond to the climate crisis by turning against one another in fear or turning toward one another in love. I saw one juror after another say, yes, Your Honor, I'll do whatever you tell me to do, even if I think it is morally wrong. And when I saw that, I saw how some of the great mass atrocities in history can happen. I saw that, on the one hand, if people let go of their moral authority, any atrocity is possible. This is the same kind of thing that we heard. For example, if you saw the wonderful movie Hannah Arendt,
Yes.
this is just the argument
Right.
that she's having.
Yeah, it made me think of that.
I saw that on the one hand, if people let go of their moral authority, any atrocity is possible. But on the other hand, when people hold on to their conscience and the shared moral agency of this community, no institution and no power can be unaffected. That's why part of why I'm going to divinity school, he says. Let's see. I want to read a little more about basically why he thinks this is important and how it will affect us. And I think that again is related to what we're here today for. The interviewer asks, looking ahead further, how do you think that the climate crisis will affect our future? He answers, I think it will cause massive food shortages and disruptions of our agricultural system. At the same time, we're looking at an ever-increasing number of migrants whose homes are underwater, and literally, not financially, and who are moving into areas that are already stressed because of droughts, because of food shortages, because of a generally unworkable economic model. These communities are already insecure. They'll have waves of other people coming in who are completely insecure themselves, and we can see the conflicts that will come from that. There will be plenty of opportunities for those in power to pit people at the bottom against one another, to say, the hardships you're facing, those are the people Those are the people who are causing them. That group, whether it's migrants or unions or religious groups or whatever it might be. If we're not ready for that as a society, if we're not committed to a path of cooperation, then there's potential for us to create a really ugly society that could bring out the worst in us. People feeling insecure can be driven to do very ugly things to their fellow human beings. I think there's also the potential for the opposite to happen. People in times of hardship can turn toward one another, and hardship can bring out the best in people. And he gives sort of two contrasting examples. The Hurricane Katrina, which became a sort of militarized nightmare, where people, especially poor and black people, they just became the enemy. And on the other hand, Hurricane Sandy, where an important part of the response to Hurricane Sandy was the people of Occupy, these sort of self-organizing groups who were there, came in and responded. And so he tells a story of a man who had been beaten by a policeman in Zuccotti Square, who was helping shovel out the basement of that same policeman. So anyhow. When Sandy happened, we realized that's what the Occupy people were doing. They were getting ready for whatever lay ahead. That's why, he says, I think activism right now is so critical. The only inevitable thing about our future is that the status quo cannot continue. We know things will change, but we can go down very different roads from this point. There's an opportunity now to build a society in the ashes of this one that is much more in line with our values. There's the opportunity for this disruption to be a sort of a mass reflection about where we realize that basing society on greed and competition was not the best way to go about things. Maybe we can do better. That's not inevitable any more than the ugly path is inevitable, which to me is why our engagement now is really, really critical. So that's it.
Very good. Thank you, Stu.
And
That
this
was
is
very
from,
moving.
this is from
Responses to
June
Stu.
4th. If anybody wants to look up the full interview, which is worth reading, it's an interview with Sarah Van Gelder on June 4th.
Common Dreams.
From Common Dreams, thank you. Yeah.
Responses to Stu?
I have no response to that, but because I totally believe that all of what's happening, climate change is going to contribute to far more wars and if we, almost unimaginable wars in the future over, as you say, resources.
Okay,
food,
let's go on, Carl.
water.
Carl's going to say something about
Karen?
Oh,
You sure?
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Hillary cries havoc.
Indeed. And let's slip the dogs of war, as Henry Fisk says. I'm referring to the fact that Hillary Clinton is being cried up as our next president. The Financial Times this morning, the Financial Times is probably the leading English language newspaper these days. It's published in London, but much read in the U.S. and elsewhere, and speaks for the intelligent business community, I mean, essentially our masters. And they talk about Hillary as essentially our next president on the occasion of her launching on a book tour. She's published a book about her life and hard times, and it bears it's important. The book is important. Well, the book is, of course, campaign fluff, and so forth. It's important the way Obama's Audacity of Hope, which many people learned to call the Mendacity of Hope, was that it was an audition piece. Here's my position, and it's a example of what we're going to get. In fact, it's worthwhile if we want to know about some of the things that are going on in the Obama administration today, particularly in regard to transparency and the anti-war movement and so forth. Go back and read Obama's audition piece, The Audacity of Hope, where he talks about the Vietnam War and how he would react, at least by implication, were he in a position, surprisingly enough, to do anything about it. Mrs. Clinton has done the same thing there's a full chapter in the book on the Benghazi business, or at least some aspects of the Benghazi business, those aspects the Republicans have been using to attack the Democrats. What we don't find there is a real description of what was actually going on in Benghazi that Mrs. Clinton was responsible for as Secretary of State. Because the point of Clinton's candidacy is that hers is a position of continuity of war policy with the Bush-Obama war policy. Anyone who looks at the history of the last decade, assuming there are historians around at all, or anyone around a generation from now to look at it, they'll see the absolute continuity of American policy through the decade. And Mrs. Clinton, regardless of the change in parties, Republican and Democrat, and Mrs. Clinton clearly means to continue that, at least as vigorously as Obama. Obama was quoted last year as saying he was surprised to find that his long suit was killing people and that he'd gotten good at it. Well, Mrs. Clinton, that suggests, was probably less surprised that will be her long suit, and she's already quite good at it. We will continue the war, the Bush-Obama war, in the next presidency, regardless of who's president, even though 70% of Americans are opposed to the ongoing war policy of this government. The U.S. has 1,000 military bases around the world in more than 130 countries. Mrs. Clinton talks about that. And these bases are bases for American Special Operation Forces. Special Operation Forces is the American euphemism for death squads. What Special Operations do is kidnapping, we call it rendition, assassination, when we don't use drones we use the Special Operations folks, and limited wars under the radar, notably in Africa. Special operations American Special Operations are operating in all but 2 countries of Africa these days, and in many cases vigorous fighting is going on by these American death squads. Obama is, of course, running the world's greatest terrorist campaign right now, the drone campaign, and the global, it is worldwide, even involving places like the Philippines, assassination campaign, where his main job is to lie to the American people about how the war is winding down, about how withdrawing and so forth, while he is in fact presiding over a war that ensures the profits of the American 1% around the world. And he actually has some new problems on his plate in that the ability to control the sphere of influence of Russia and China is declining. And as a result, the U.S. is saying, hey, look, they're making war, and therefore we've got to make war against them. And we're doing that from Ukraine to the South China Sea. Obama's principal job, of course, is to lie to the American people about the war, and therefore it's important to see that Mrs. Clinton is at least as vigorous as Obama is about the war. And we have an interesting example of that. This is from the important website antiwar.com. In May of 2012, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton went to the Special Operations Forces Industry Conference. Let's dwell on that notion, Special Operation Forces Industry. This is the modern version of the military-industrial complex, right? It was a trade show in Tampa, Florida, and she spoke, as she was Secretary of State at the time, she spoke at the trade show to share her vision of, quote, smart power, close quote, a note she has from the awful Samantha Power from the Kennedy School of Government, share her vision of smart power and to explain the State Department's crucial role in extending the reach and efficacy of America's growing, quote, international counterterrorism network. First, there is such a thing as a Special Operation Forces Industry Conference trade show. Without some keen reporting from the people at Wired magazine, an interesting publication worth watching, that peculiar get-together might have flown completely under the radar. And radar is not a metaphor here, of course. Much like the shadowy industry it both supports and feeds off of, like a sleek camouflage lamprey attached to a taxpayer-fattened shark. The prose gets a little purple here because they're talking about things that aren't talked about elsewhere. The fact that we have this military-industrial conflict sending out people to kill people around the world, and the patron of it, in this case, was the Secretary of State. Second, special operations have officially metastasized into a full-fledged industry. United States Special Operations Command is located at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, and therefore conveniently located near the Special Operations Trade Show, which happened again this year at the Tampa Convention Center. The theme was, quote, strengthening the global SOF network, close quote, Special Operation Forces. And the 600,000 square foot facility was filled with targets of opportunity for well-connected and well-heeled defense contractors. You see, the interest in maintaining America's killing around the world, which is what this is about, is in the hands of the American 1% of American business, directly in cases like defense contractors, and indirectly in terms of the rest of the American capitalist enterprise, in that the complacent world, the rest of the world is the essential field for the profits of American business, as it's been since the Second World War. Third, and finally, Hillary's widely ignored speech marked a radical departure from the widely held perception that the State Department's diplomatic mission endures as an institutional alternative to the Pentagon's military planning. You know, I got the Pentagon out there running wars, but got the State Department around doing diplomacy, making nice, you know, so forth and so on. Well, in fact, as recently as the first Clinton administration, the U.S. spoke of full spectrum dominance, by which it meant using all government agencies on land, sea, and air, and in space to maintain the military domination that the U.S. has had since World War II, and that many people saw slipping away from the end of the 20th century. America's lead diplomat, which is what Miss Clinton was at the time, stood before the shadow war industry and itemized the integration of the State Department's planning and personnel with the Pentagon's global counterterrorism campaign, which, she told the Special Operations Industry, happened, quote, in one form or another in more than 100 countries around the world. In fact, in the book, she says 130 countries, and that's what the Special Operations people themselves are claiming. So what we have here is a creature of the war industry, perfectly in continuity with the American war policy of this last generation, and in continuity with the neoliberal economic transformation of America over the last 40 years. That's what Mrs. Clinton is. Now, of course, given the sham nature of American democracy, there won't be any opposition to her, either in the Democratic Party or from the Republicans, standing up and saying, look, we don't want a president who will bring more war for the benefit of the 1%. We'd like a president who would restore the American economy, for example. That's not going to happen. I mean, we didn't see it in this last election, and it won't in this coming election. First of all, there's no more anti-war wing to the Democratic Party. Obama has essentially destroyed that. And although there is, surprisingly enough, an anti-war wing to the Republican Party, it's vestigial, and the person who might be its candidate has shown his willingness to go over to the side of a full spectrum dominance, whole government approach that the Clintons are talking about. I'm talking about Senator Rand Paul. So there are not too many political examples of an alternative to Mrs. Clinton. It's very clear that American warfare capitalism is ready for Hillary.
Thank you, Carl. Questions or comments for Carl? My impression is that what you call the anti-war wing of the Republican Party consists of approximately 5 people. But
well, I'll give you a counterexample. Look what Ron Paul, I mean, I admit there are ambiguities about Rand Paul, interesting ambiguities, but Ron Paul brought a rally to the University of Illinois and filled a hall at the University of Illinois with the largest room on campus with people for an anti-war message. Now, people were cheering the anti-war message, and that was the theme of what he had to talk about. Now, he's still making that talk. The anti-war message was put down pretty heavily at the last Republican National Convention, and the Republican organization is worried about the fact that they have that much of a following. But the wing exists. Look, 70% of Americans say they're opposed to more war in Asia. That was about the percentage of Americans who said they were opposed to more war in Southeast Asia by the end of the 1960s. But the brilliance of our political leadership is that they're able to carry on the war in the face of that opposition and indeed minimize that opposition, keep it down. As I say, Obama has destroyed the anti-war wing of the Democratic Party. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any opposition to Mrs. Clinton's war making. I doubt there will be, even though there is an element there still on the American political scene.
Yeah, I think she has shown herself to be more aggressive on the whole even than Barack Obama. But anyway,
Yes. Secretary of State.
let's go on. Press on here. On my left, Karen 1.
Okay.
Karen
Karen
1.
won.
I'm 2. No, I'm Karen 2, remember? Karen 1.
In the past week, friends have asked me what the official response or just the general feeling of the peace anti-war community is on the issue of the recent prisoner exchange, where prisoner of war Sergeant Bo Bergdahl was exchanged for 5 Guantanamo Bay prisoners, who, by the way, are not labeled as prisoners of war, but as enemy combatants, but they're the same. There seems to be a lot of discussion whether Bergdahl, quote, deserves release. I cannot speak for the peace community, but only for myself. Nobody deserves to be tortured. Bergdahl needs to be returned to his family and welcomed home and cared for. All of his wounds need to be cared for, the wounds created by the United States by sending him into danger, the wounds created by asking him to hurt other human beings, and the wounds created by his capture. If someone wants to try Bergdahl for anything, including desertion, then take it to court. Don't try him in the media. To that possibility, Bergdahl is an individual and can easily be charged. He is not a corporation or a government or the military, where there is no way to bring it to trial or to punish it. The New York Times seems to be a tiny bit better in their reporting by not just interviewing people that they are handed by the political parties. For instance, the New York Times has reported that several people have said that Sergeant Bergdahl showed interest in humanitarian activities like passing out food or medical supplies to Afghan villagers or helping Afghan soldiers who are U.S. soldiers' partners in this to repair their buildings. A lot of people join the military to help people. A lot of my friends' children say that they want to help people, and that's why they want to join the military. Bergdahl is reported to have read books while his fellow soldiers watched videos. I would hope I would more often choose learning over entertainment. As to the claims that 6 people died searching for Bergdahl, these are boldly untrue, and again, this would need to be proved or disproved in court, not the media. Bergdahl went missing on June 30th. Those 6 soldiers that died 2 months later in 4 separate missions. They certainly were not rescue missions. For example, one of those deaths was during an Afghan National Security Force mission, which is not a rescue mission. The people in Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay, also need to be tried or released, and they have already been there so long that speedy trial has been denied them. So the United States and its citizens are guilty for allowing this to happen, as well as for the torture that occurred at Guantanamo prisons. And yes, force-feeding people on a hunger strike is torture. Keeping people in cages without proving their guilt is torture. Waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivations. We are still allowing this to happen. In fact, a new prison is being built there so we don't have to prove guilt to justify the incarceration of people. As to calling the 5 people exchanged as Taliban leaders, there is a huge number of people called Taliban leaders. I mean, the number keeps growing. It's a never-ending number of leaders of the Taliban. In summary, nobody deserves to be tortured, and the media should not convict people, and I hope that Bergdahl can heal from all of his suffering. Embrace him and welcome him home.
Thank you, Karen. This will have to be brief. Any response to?
I have one moment,
Okay.
yeah,
Yes.
just one thing. I thought we set a precedent with the Nuremberg trials that saying I was only obeying orders to shoot or kill or to commit an atrocity, that was not an acceptable excuse. You were not exonerated from taking responsibility. So I would think that using that as a precedent, that when what Bergdahl did by walking away might exonerate him.
Yeah. Okay, well, There's been a lot of work on that, obedience to authority and the experiments on that by Stanley Milgram and others, but we don't have time for all of that. Do you have anything else very brief, Karen?
No, go ahead. Stanley
Okay.
Milgram?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, it's called obedience to authority, and it's
Okay.
absolutely hair-raising.
okay.
Okay, we have only about 5 minutes left, and with that, we're going to sign off here and bring to you a short video, about 3.5 minutes, of advice from a military veteran to young people who are thinking about entering the military and what they can expect to encounter there, including something about naive people who think that they will get something because the recruiter promised them that such and such would happen. And when they try that after they're in the military, they've taken that step forward, they will only be laughed at, but they don't know that. So let's go ahead. This is Ron Zook then signing off for Aware on the Air for June 10th, 2014. From my right, Stu and Deb, myself, Carl, and the two Karens down there. And look for us Saturday morning at the Urbana Farmers Market, and we'd be glad to talk to you there.
I say this to my own kids, and I've got one in the Army, and I got another one thinking about it. I mean, I know it's a tough economic choice to make these days. I know the jobs suck. I know school is too expensive for a lot of people. You know, I know they make it attractive, but you just you have to continue to remember what it is that they're doing. They're not, that organization does not exist to give you money for school. That organization exists to assert the political will of the United States government against other people by force of arms. And what they do is not like it's portrayed in the movies. They're not sending you out there to be a hero, they're sending you out there to be a bully. You know, they're not sending you out there to be a hero. That's not what it's really about. It's never been about that. It's never been about that. You know, the fact that some people fight back and put you in danger is also part of the equation, but, you know, it's not, the Iraqis never presented any threat to this country. And if we leave, those Iraqis don't present any threat to this country after we leave. Why put yourself in a position to go over there and be forced by a circumstance not of your choosing to take the life of another human being who's a total stranger? Because they're not, you know, they're not some evil caricature like you've seen in the films and all that stuff. They're people. They have mothers, they have fathers, they have sisters, they have brothers, they have children. You know, there's people that love them just like there's people that love you. You know, and those people grieve when they lose them, just like people grieve if they lose you. You know, that's maybe not as dramatic and as exciting, you know, and clear cut, you know, and easy to understand as you know, the sort of simple binary world of good and evil that you get painted for you, but that's not the way the real world is. You know, and in the real world, again, you have to live with the consequences of your decisions the rest of your life. Think hard. So I served in 8 conflict areas, and you know, I raised my right hand 8 times, or no, I raised my hand 5 times during the course of one career, and took an oath, and that oath was to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic. You know, I went to 8 conflict areas. I never met a single person who was an enemy of the United States Constitution. Not one. There are no enemies of the Constitution. I did spend a lot of time going out there again and becoming a political instrument, you know, for transnational corporations and to preserve American, you know, military and political supremacy around the world. But that's not in the oath. That's not in the oath. There were nobody threatening the Constitution in Vietnam. There was nobody threatening the Constitution in Grenada, Guatemala, El Salvador, Colombia, Peru, Somalia, Haiti. I went to all those places. I never met anybody that was a threat to the Constitution or the principles of the Constitution, for that matter. You know, I just met people. I just met people, and they put me in circumstances where I had to do a lot of things that I wish I didn't have in my head right now.